茅山派入邊啊，有一種改命大法，將個命途多舛嘅人咧，幫佢改命。
Definitely the scariest horror movie I've ever seen. Based on a true Taiwanese folktale, Spy Fairy, the bone-chilling Chinese horror is a dark reflection of humanity, and even Chu Runmei, who is the shadow of countless childhoods, is not even a fraction of what she is. Catch up with her, love her, your friends of choice. The story begins with a girl named Mei, who's young and fair. Her husband loved her, and soon after they were married, they conceived a child. But she had an evil thought in her heart that he loved her very much but had nothing to do with her all day long. When she heard that Xiaomei wanted to get rid of her child, she told him in a long and serious voice that she was a gambler and had incurred a huge and unpayable debt, and that the situation had become so serious that her creditors had nothing better to do than to put up bills all day long to demand repayment of the money, and that the creditors were already blocking the doorway of her house. Xiaomei knew that giving birth to the child would only add to her burden, and she had been thinking about aborting the child ever since she was conceived, and, as the days passed by, her thoughts got stronger and stronger. As the days went by, her thoughts intensified. She couldn't eat well, she couldn't sleep, and even in the end, May's state of mind was like possessed. She was unstable. One day, she went to the toilet to throw up, but as she did so, the sound of a baby crying came to her ears. She followed the sound to the next door, but when she opened the door, there was nothing inside. She opened the second door and the third one was empty. She met her Auntie May, told her what was on her mind, and since she ran a store like this, she couldn't help but deal with ghosts and spirits. When she heard that Xiaomei wanted to get rid of the baby, she told her in a long and serious tone. In addition, May said that most couples, if they don't have children, are sure to be separated within 3 years. Yang Piao was a sinful debtor, and together they would only drag each other down. But if she had the choice, May wouldn't have wanted it that way. But her husband, who was so devoted to being alone, didn't give a damn about the family, and instead dragged his partners into the water with him. But while they were arguing over the debt, a woman approached them and offered them a chance to turn their lives around, so the plot could help. But while they were quarreling over their debts, a woman came to their door and presented them with a chance to turn their lives around, and I had to share it with my girlfriends. Are you still watching movies alone? Why don't you try probing and find a new friend in your neighborhood? I don't know, I'm going to go probing and look for a cute girl. He took a USB flash drive out of his bag and said that it's a spooky software called Diesian, but because the developer died in a car accident while he was working on it, the system was not working properly, and he was not able to get a hold of the system. The reason why the woman approached Aaron and the others was to beg them to help her write the remaining parts of the software. As long as the software was completed smoothly, money would not be a problem. However, after hearing what they said, Xiaomei always felt that this matter was very sinister and she had a bad premonition about it, so she tried to persuade her husband, and the woman pulled out a huge check from her purse. Finally, in order to improve the software, they also decided to experience the divination ritual called Folding of Immortals in the evening. First, they lit candles and incense in a dark room, and then they put their hands on it to summon the Folding of Immortals. But the promise she had made that night was not true. 16, in view of this, went to buy lottery tickets, not realizing that they had really won a big prize. Upon learning this news, Alung decided that Dixian was a software that could really make money, and once it was successfully developed, they would be able to make a fortune. But they didn't know that the slightest hint of their hearts would bring them to an even more disastrous end. The folding immortals, a divination ritual, is actually much more than that. It is said that the early folding immortals were derived from the Taoist art of ambush, which was a means of communicating with the dead, and that it could indeed foresee the imminence of the coming battle. However, when the person who failed to do so had a distracted mind and an impure mind, the one who was recruited would not be an immortal, but a grievous and resentful soul, and once a grievous soul was recruited, the stars would be plagued with disasters and the people would die a violent death. They have already done so without realizing it. The next morning, he read shocking news online that the woman had been brutally murdered by a customer overnight, and her body was found by a neighbor due to the smell. Since the client that night was alive and she hadn't entertained anyone else, it seemed impossible for her to have been killed. To verify if she was dead or alive, Kung returned to the red light district that night. As he arrived, he saw someone burning paper money and calling out a woman's name in the street. In disbelief, he cautiously approached and was so frightened that he quickly ran away and got into a rented car. But the promise she made that night. But the promise she had made that night was remembered by the dead man, and as soon as he caught his breath. At that moment, Kung's neck became more and more suffocated. When the driver arrived at the station, he got off the car and saw that he had died in a twisted shape on the back seat. However, except for Kung himself, no one knew how he died, and even his colleagues did not take Kung's death seriously. Even Fan joked that perhaps Kung had indulged too much in his life, so he was haunted by lustful ghosts. After saying that, he went out to go to a date with a man as if he had nothing to do with the matter. After he had some money, Lung started to go to the casino without telling his wife, and within a few rounds, he had lost all his money, so he had no choice but to return home with his money. But as soon as he got into his car, he heard a passerby talking about a man who had jumped down from this place last night, and had been reduced to a bloody mess. But when he glanced out the window, he saw a scene of horror. Lung didn't care about it, but when he accidentally looked out the window, he saw something horrifying. The woman's strange appearance terrified him, and he wanted to flee, but his body wouldn't obey. But she escaped and left from the building as usual. The woman behind her stood up once more and dashed towards the rooftop, as if she was trapped in a never-ending cycle of desperation. Witnessing this terrifying scene, Alung was drenched in sweat from sheer fear. While Alung had narrowly escaped the disaster, Fan was caught in a series of bizarre occurrences on the opposite side of the building. On her way back home, she suddenly sensed someone trailing her. Before she could process what was happening, she was struck by a forceful verbal assault that disoriented her completely. When Fuan regained consciousness, she was horrified to discover a woman lying dead beside her. This woman was none other than the man's wife. She had wed Fuan to liberate herself from her family's constraints and had mercilessly slain the wife she had been sharing her life with. It was then that Fuan truly understood the real nature of her man's friend. With considerable effort, she managed to escape from him. However, just as she thought she was free, she found herself once again within his grasp. But as soon as she ran away, she encountered something even more terrifying than her boyfriend. At that critical moment, Fan managed to escape by sheer luck and made her way to Lung and his wife, telling them everything she had been through. She believed that the recent Jimbo ceremony must have attracted something sinister, so she felt it was necessary to halt the software's listing. However, Lung had already announced the listing, and canceling it would likely lead to facing compensation claims amounting to tens of millions of dollars. To resolve this issue quickly, they decided to call Auntie Mui for assistance. Yet, no sooner had the couple exited the car than Fan encountered another horror. She sensed something outside the vehicle and instinctively glanced up, only to see a girl in a school uniform staring blankly at her from a distance. Terrified, she screamed in fear, but the girl appeared behind her in the very next instant. When they returned to the car, Fan had already disappeared, and May guessed that something had happened to her. May called the police, but the phone rang from behind her for no apparent reason. May tried to call the police, but her husband refused to listen and told her to get into the car, or else he'd leave her in the countryside, as if she had some unknown secret in her heart. But on the way back, Xiaomei kept asking her husband why he didn't want to report the case to the police. The wife's persistent pressure on her made Lung's heart feel very heavy. Eventually, he couldn't take it any longer and told her the secret he had kept hidden for so long. The night before the opening of the company, some of the men went out to the wilderness to celebrate the opening of the company, and they went out drinking until midnight. But on the way, they came across a girl wearing a school uniform who was in a panic and was trying her hardest to break down the windows of the car, crying out for help. When they got out of the car, Chang stopped them, thinking that the company was set to open the next day and couldn't risk any accidents at such a crucial time. So, in the spirit of better safe than sorry, they quickly drove away. However, right after they left, the girl was tragically killed by the criminals. Her wrongful death turned her into a ghost, and since their ceremony a few days earlier wasn't performed sincerely, her vengeful spirit was naturally drawn to the company. Her aim was not just to seek revenge on the criminals, but also to drag Lung and his gang to hell to avenge the deaths she witnessed during her own murder. When May discovered the truth, she feared she might be the next victim after Kang and Fun's deaths, and this fear consumed her until she was suddenly killed. Aunt May's house. Auntie May scolded them, but ultimately, they could escape the soul's demands by altering the 8 characters with Mao Shan's Taoist number. Finally, Auntie Mui has arranged a hanging rope for the 2 of them. When the moment arrives, one of them can ascend first. Then, the other will be lowered down until their lives are transformed. Afterward, they can ascend again. It is suspected that the other one might be the one who recently passed away. But as time went by, she realized that it wouldn't be long before the waves of the desert and the plasma and the fires of the war, and that she didn't know anything about the world and the sea. Soon after the story began, the unjustly killed girl appeared behind Auntie May, who immediately picked up a piece of paper, but as soon as she tried to do so, the candles and wax candles in front of her burnt down completely. Witnessing this, Auntie May was shocked. She could never have imagined that the girl's grievances were so strong that they were unimaginable, and as she walked towards the hospital, a wisp of crabs rose from the surrounding area, and Auntie May was also struck by a strand of something. Auntie May died in front of her eyes, but in order not to let her die in vain, they had to finish the reformation as soon as possible, so Lung quickly hoisted his wife up, and took out a new 8 characters and stuck them on the wall, and only when she was about to suffocate did she cut the rope, and finally succeeded in completing the reformation. However, as time went on, she was about to be strangled to death, but May had no intention of cutting the rope. Even in the end, she turned her back and watched as her husband was strangled to death. The reason she acted this way was quite simple. Lung had been gambling all day without remorse, and even if saved, he would remain a toxic presence. So, to avoid being implicated in her husband's death, May chose to leave him alone. After his death, the wrongful deaths of her daughters were also carried away. With her husband gone, the girls' ghosts were dispersed, and Xiaomei's life returned to a state of peace and tranquility. Without life's pressures, she decided to continue with her pregnancy as usual. However, upon arriving at the hospital for her checkup, she was met with a horrifying surprise. Okay, that's all for today's story. I'm Yasser Arafat. Subscribe for more interesting horror videos. See you next time.